Commas and dependent clauses. To first know when to use commas with dependent clause, you first have to understand what an independent clause is. So, an independent clause contains a subject and a verb and can stand on its own as a complete thought. This is what we often refer to as a sentence. So, for example, the Democratic senator still voted against the bill. Now, a dependent clause will also have a subject and verb, but it cannot stand on its own as a complete thought, and it will start with a subordinating conjunction. There are a lot of subordinating conjunctions out there, about 50, but the most common ones are as, although, because, during, even though, since, that, and when. So here's an example dependent clause, even though he didn't fully agree with his Republican colleagues. Notice that doesn't quite make sense on its own, even though it does have a subject, he, and a verb, agree. Now, here's the key piece of information. Dependent clauses must be attached to independent clauses. So we could attach, even though he didn't fully agree with his Republican colleagues, to the independent clause, the Democratic senators still vote against the bill. And we would have a complete sentence that makes sense. The Democratic senator still voted against the bill, even though he didn't fully agree with his Republican colleagues. Now, the issue is, when do we use commas with dependent clauses? If the dependent clause is at the beginning of the sentence, you must put a comma after the dependent clause. Even though he didn't fully agree with his Republican colleagues, comma, the Democratic senator still voted against the bill. If a dependent clause is in the middle of the sentence, you need a comma before and after the clause to offset it. The Democratic senator, comma, even though he didn't fully agree with his Republican colleagues, comma, still voted against the bill. If the dependent clause is at the end of the sentence, no comma is needed. So, how can you check your sentence for dependent clauses? The easiest way to do that is look for subordinating conjunctions, like although, as, because, during, even so, since, that, and when. Another way is to do what I call the pause test. Read the sentence out loud, and if you pause, you'll often find that it's because there's a dependent clause at the beginning of the sentence. If you're pausing in the middle, it might mean that you have a dependent clause in the middle. So those are just a couple little tips for how to punctuate your sentences with dependent clauses.